Sweet. Awesome. GreyNoise gang. What's up? Let's ride. I don't know. I don't know how to YouTube like the rest of these people. So yeah, thank you, Sam, for organizing this. I will text Andrew Morris as soon as this is over and say this is the greatest thing GreyNoise has ever done. Give Sam a promotion, give Kimber a promotion, give Bob a promotion.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so yeah, we'll no, this has been fun, and I think that like gathering like-minded people can be really valuable, especially as Matt said, like we're all super disparate and tied in with what we're all doing every day. And getting the same people in the same physical place can be really hard. So it's cool that we're able to sort of have this almost like a non-cringy focus group to sort of chat about these things. So my name's Greg. I work at a company called Proofpoint. We are predominantly an email company. So you can think of my life as trying to make sure bad things don't hit our customers via email. And I work within our sort of targeted threats, counter espionage, APT team, tracking those threats in particular. And so what I wanted to talk about today is methods of finding threat signals. Matt mentioned a little bit of Anthony Bourdain. So in sticking with the chef theme, I'll be channeling a little bit of Brad Leone in my presentation, much less professional, much more goofy, but hopefully just as fun and entertaining. And so we'll talk about what sort of signal we're looking for, and then the sort of methods I use for finding signal. And I should say that this is like things that I've made up in my head. I was never a signals intelligence analyst. I've never done sort of like the other sort of style hacker thing of like radio or Wi-Fi collection, trying to find those like literal like signals in the air. So this is just a way that I sort of look at finding anomalies within data that could be indicative of maliciousness. To give you an idea of sort of like why this is important for us, in my case, it's important to sift through the noise that we see every day. Proofpoint is, as I said, at its core, an email delivery service. To find threats in that data, which are actual threats instead of just weird things, is critical to making sure that like the CEOs whose security teams buy our products get their emails, because a whole ton of bad stuff happens to the people we like in the security space if the CEOs don't get their emails to close deals and whatever business people do. And so even if we filter that down through like all of the unique data that we actually see on a day-to-day basis, and we get to those almost 500,000 malware samples that Proofpoint sees, finding those that are new and novel tends to be a priority for our team. I'm sure in the same way that tracking trends, as well as finding new things that are getting scanned for, is a priority for the GreyNoise team or whatever other teams you all are on. And so finding those things is hugely important. And doing that through signals is how I like to sort of think about those things. And I sort of think about signal versus detection on a spectrum. And so trying to like suss this out, an example of that would be that Agent Tesla, it's a gross, I think written in .NET info stealer that a ton of different people can buy. And so we have had detection for it for a long time. And of course it evolves and we want to evolve with that detection. But what is often more interesting to us as we filter through our data on a day-to-day basis is a sample of something that is doing something malicious, but not hitting a quote unquote named signature. So that way we can assess what the campaign is and what it's doing. We can put it in front of our sandbox and detection teams to ensure we know what it is, if we've seen it before, and how we can prevent delivery of it to our customers going forward. We see new loaders in the space all the time. So sort of like GreyNoise, it's kind of fun to get those tip-offs from weird stuff as it's sort of evolving. So what we really want is hints of previously unknown evil. And I'm just going to blatantly steal this slide from Steve Miller, because everything exists on a spectrum, or in this case, a detectrum. And effectively, you can sort of think about the left side being, hey, this C2 has been previously used by this group yesterday. We can attribute it that way. They've even used this exact binary before. We can attribute something that way to, hey, this weird file is doing some weird stuff on a host. It's making DNS requests to like really long subdomains, but it's not necessarily doing DNS tunneling. We need a human to sort of figure this out. And you can sort of think about things that way, where signals being effectively the things that make a more senior analyst's neck, hairs on the back of their neck tingle and say, this is weird, and it's definitely not something that we have looked at before. And so a more direct example of this in Yara format, because of course I love Yara, the rule on the left is looking for a known malware family called gold backdoor, based on a litany of features and encoded strings that it has in the LNK icon file that it is packaged in. And then the one on the right is looking for some of the very specific behavior that that particular sample has. And I think this is a good example because the .lnk, and it didn't show up as well in this one, but the find string are present in both of them. And so a name detection would be something like this particular example on the left. And more of a signal would be looking for any LNK that has those other two strings that would indicate that it's parsing itself to potentially look for something else to execute inside of its overlay. And the creative sort of like, I forget which side of the brain Santiago had mentioned, can always really help with that sort of like ideation of finding weird things that way. So two things, in my opinion, that we want to be able to do. One is take advantage of attacker mistakes. One of these, I'm sure our friends at GreyNoise see all the time, could be scanning the whole internet with an exploit instead of a list of refined targets. Seeing a Citrix vulnerability getting scanned on a device that is emulating, I don't know, like a generic web server would probably indicate an attacker mistake rather than something really crafty. Another sort of attacker mistake could be like a typo in the host name, a typo in one of the fields that prevents parsing from happening accurately, or whatever else. And the other thing that we want to sort of mine and derive signal from is identify any sort of precursors or prerequisites to evil things happening. Sort of like what Kimber talked about in her last talk. Not that much is new and novel. And so how can we find things that are new, but with things that we already know to be bad, or things that we can sort of sit on and wait around for something evil to happen with? And so ideally, where we all want to be in sort of like this signal identification chain is this example from, I don't know, some guy named Andrew on the internet, where prior to worm activity happening, seeing an IP hitting your network that does a port scan and then a banner crawl, we want to start prioritizing finding that, isolating that IP address, or capturing everything it's doing to potentially capture attempted exploit delivery, potentially in a product that we didn't even know was vulnerable. So that's sort of like where all this signal and discovery stuff wants to end up, because finding the worm is cool, but capturing the exploit, finding the vuln, getting the ODE in your name to prevent the worm is also, I think where we're all pretty aligned on, no, we want to prevent all this bad stuff from happening and sort of prioritize finding it. So before I get into the examples, the last sort of like big picture example I wanted to give was an example of the PanOS exploit that I think everybody's cared about the last couple of weeks after Velexity found it. Andrew previously tweeted about this scanner saying it was scanning for the PanOS exploit, especially because its user agent very kindly gives that away with the PanOS exploit. But it's not technically exploiting the vuln. And so this is sort of an example where we have junk noise that we don't want to bucket in our queues of things to look at. I think Konstantin on the team as well did a bunch of stuff to identify like fake exploits for the PanOS stuff. But then if we get into like where the real signal is, something that Hacking LZ Justin found on one of his honeypots that's actually doing that exploitation was completely elsewhere in sort of the HTTP header. It was set inside of its cookie, and it just sort of looks like kind of strange. There's some parsing going on, but we can sort of sit back and say like, okay, this even just looks more legit to what we are expecting this vulnerability to look like and where we expect it to be. So we're going to explore some methods of how we could go about finding signal among that noise. So the first method, and again, these are all just made up terms that like how I think about things, not anything that some textbook or real signals processing person would tell you is real. The first method I call amplification, and we'll use the initial Barracuda email device exploitation that Mandiant found back in, I think, June 2023. That a good friend of mine, Austin Larson, worked on. And the vuln involved sending a .tar file archive that would exploit a weakness in the Barracuda ESG device. And so let's look at the tar file that's doing that. Embedded in it, we can see a bunch of text files that all have this sort of alphabet thing starting out at the end of it. But to the trained eye, you'll notice one is not like the others. The top file is actually where the exploit lies because it gets mishandled by the vulnerable ESG devices. And the file name in that tar archive is actually then gets handled as a string and then parsed as a command by the underlying OS. So kind of an early thing for your mail server to be just running commands willy-nilly, but that is effectively what was going on. And so if we dig a little bit more into it, that string gets decoded and it does a bunch of stuff to like transfer ownership of commands and pipes through that series of commands. But effectively what it does is download and execute a passive backdoor called cspy. It's pretty cool. And even though it's a little unfortunate, this is sort of an overview of what that attack chain looks like. So email comes in, ESG unfortunately gets effectively lands a vulnerability in ESG allows the attacker to sort of land a reverse shell that they can then upload cspy through and then PCAP filter and monitor all the traffic to intercept incoming emails and eventually try and move laterally within the network. So how do we use this case to create some hypotheses about how to find other files or commands run by this group or other files exploiting the same vulnerability, or even thinking bigger picture, how do we find other weird things that are hiding in file names? We look a lot at attachments in our sandbox, but not necessarily sort of at like a half a step higher at what the actual file names are. I work in the APT team, so I look for a lot of like geopolitically themed lure names, but how do we sort of amplify what we're looking for with these file names? And so some of our options include we could look for the base 64 strings like setsid or mkfifo or even plain text versions of those commands. We could look for just the presence of a long base 64-ish blob within the file name. Alternatively, we could take a little bit of a step up and look for the geometry of the tar files that contain only a bunch of text files and no other file types. But the one that we actually settled on was looking for the pairing of the normal quote and the backtick quote that could lead a file name to getting parsed as a command like it was in the first place. And so then we can start going through our internal systems, and instead of looking for all of these commands and things like that can change, the fact that there are, two quote characters at the beginning and two quote characters at the end, at least tells me that, hey, this is something that might not be doing that Barracuda ESG stuff, but it's probably doing something not great. So let's just go look for file names that start and end with those quotes. And if we broaden that a little bit, things in our data start turning up some really strange recon where targets are getting PNG or Excel files or DAT files that then run NS lookup commands. For what purposes, I'm not entirely sure, but it definitely is not something that we would want our clients being able to receive and have their email devices or their hosts potentially parse these things or run them. And so I think just to sort of highlight our path there, we went from that Barracuda ESG very specific vulnerability to let's look for anything, as Kimber said, like there isn't a lot that's new and novel. Let's look for anything that could be accidentally parsed by the server as a string and a command, and let's see if we can find other stuff that's doing that. So that's sort of amplification as a given example. So let's flip that on its head in its next method. And since this is the GreyNoise event, let's jump into the GreyNoise platform. I really wanted to find a tasty example today from the Pan OS stuff, but only 15 scanners that GreyNoise was seeing did not prove my point. So we're going to bring us back to some PTSD with Log4j exploitation. And even today in GreyNoise, there are 958 unique IPs hitting GreyNoise sensors. And so that's a lot, and that's far too many of them to triage. So we'll talk a little bit about filtering them down. And filtering is exactly what it says on the tin. So if we jump into the IPs, some things immediately stand out to try and pick things to filter down. Benign tags are really good for this to sort of explore because they often co-occur with other things. Like you can see that top example does some TLS crawling, it does web crawling, it has an SSH brute forcer, and all these sort of like unrelated, but often, generally bad things are going on in those scanners. So in my interpretation of that data, these are things that are multi-purpose scanners rather than things specifically trying to exploit Log4j. And so we can refine our already simple query to a very simple one as well by removing any instances of the web crawler tag, and that suddenly filters us down from what I think it was like 16 or 1200 down to 29 results. And to me, because all of these, and we'll show some of them, or you can sort of run this on your own. I don't have any specific examples of it. Suddenly, we only get dedicated scanners that only have the Log4j exploit attempt. So that's a much more manageable number to start monitoring for and start mining for looking for additional threat sort of identification parts in it. That filtering was actually really helpful back when the Log4j crisis kicked off in like December 2022 or whatever it was. And on the team that I was on previously at Recorded Future, it really helped us find only the interesting payloads instead of the generic ones, because we could start mining things, directly out of GreyNoise, like looking through the web paths and the user agent strings where some of these payloads were attempting to get delivered. They could be sort of all over anywhere in the HTTP sort of request, but because GreyNoise exposes the data in the web paths and the user agents, we could then hop on those and see what was interesting. And following back all of those commands to what they ended up being was a lot of Cobalt Strike and a lot of sort of generic shells and a lot of this like interact sh common callback stuff. But also in there were some much more nasty things that would eventually lead to ransomware or more specialized malware families. So it was well worth our effort. It made us look really smart in front of our customers. We found some uniquely fun stuff in there to sort of report on. And so I think filtering is pretty straightforward. So we'll keep it moving here. The next method I want to talk about is layering, or looking for features in the signal alongside the intended phenomena that we want to find. Phenomena in this case just being anything generically malicious, or combinations of weak signals. So either one or the other. And so looking for what I would call a weak signal is something like looking for the string base64 in any web path that GreyNoise sees a scanner trying to connect to. And if we look for that, we get 1,200 results. And again, I'm just a human. I'm not a big data person. And it's a lot of results to parse. So we can sort of introduce layering to try and find other potentially interesting things. And then so if we layer that or combine it with a string where we're looking for eval also in that web path, we get a much more manageable result or set of data. There are only 19 of them, some with a ton of tags, like this top example here with a bunch of stuff that I don't know, like Joomla and Commvault, bypass or exploitation attempts, some Oracle stuff in there. But then you land on something potentially more interesting with this 180 address coming out of the Baidu Netcom ASN. Surprise, surprise. So GreyNoise does not have this IP tagged as malicious. This is not like a gotcha thing for GreyNoise. This was just what I found this morning while poking around and running some of these queries. And we can see at the bottom there, this web path is it's sus, as the kids like to say. So it's doing some really gross Java stuff to run a base64 encoded command that can execute code from this remotely loaded URL. Seems bad. And so pivoting on that, if we anchor on that base64, the encoded value that we saw previously, that VURL sort of string and that first chunk that's encoded, we find another 1,200 results. Some of them were tagged as malicious, some of them weren't. But we only sort of stumbled upon that because we had, we'd filtered down a list of things that were doing base64-ish stuff from 1,200 results back down to 19. And it made that sort of discovery process a lot more manageable. I didn't dig any further beyond that. I'm sure you can replicate the query very easily if you'd like to. But yeah, if someone finds something interesting happening with that, let me know. But GreyNoise has been always fun to sort of have those like side rabbit holes to go down to find weird stuff happening. And I think that there's like a ton of possibility there. I'm sure the GreyNoise team already does this, but if you're sort of in the space and want to mine GreyNoise for more stuff, I always recommend looking for like these types of strings in web paths or in user agents and sort of layering them in combination with each other to try and find weird malicious stuff that can be much more manageable versus handling all 12 or 1,600 of the things that we're doing base64. So let's get into the last example, and there's a little bit of a buildup here. And we're going to go back to email data, but still in exploit land. So in August 2023, a group we call TA422, other people call APT28, Forest Blizzard, Fancy Bear, depending on whatever threat intel provider you subscribe to, Blue Delta, Strontium if you're a throwback Microsoft person, effectively spraying exploits looking for this Outlook vulnerability. And they were sending all these things from Portugal mail. And it would include this TNEF attachment that was basically a meeting reminder. And in that meeting reminder, you could pass an UNC path to it or a UNC path, where when that landed on your Outlook host, it would effectively make an SMB connection to that attacker-controlled server, that 50 address there, and disclose your a hash of your NTLM credentials, which is bad. And so the challenge that we ran into with this was the hashes and sort of the naming style of the TNEFs changed pretty regularly, and the embedded C2s changed all the time. And so sort of the normal ways that we would go about looking for malicious attachments didn't scale particularly well with this particular threat. And so taking a step back, we know that there are some elements of this that we'd want to isolate. And so if we sort of think about the email blob without necessarily having to make ourselves sad and look at an RFC, we can sort of think about it in three big chunks: the headers, the email body, and the attachments. And so looking back at that email, the headers would always change because the targets changed. The attachment names and internal values would always change. But the body itself, that test meeting, please ignore this message, was consistent throughout all of our observation. And so if we, very fortunate that at scale, we can afford to hash the message bodies and sort of isolate them. And if we did that at scale, all of a sudden we had very good signal of what was actually this actor, because we could sort of do a little bit of that isolation of the message body, because we just wrote a query. We'll go back to the email example. If we just wrote a query for anything, including test meeting and please ignore this message, we would get a lot of incidental sort of references to it. Even if we looked for this as a string, we would find it embedded in other emails or emails talking about this vulnerability or sort of anything under the sun. And so doing that sort of string searching was still a little bit too broad for us. Whereas taking just the hash of it allowed us to both highlight what is included in the message, but also, I think really importantly, isolating what is not in the message. So no other weird HTML, no other sort of words buried in there, just what that string was. And hashing can be a really powerful way of doing that. And so just hashing that body, that email is what led to a blog post getting dropped in December, and us finding, over 10,000 attempts to exploit that vulnerability against our customer set, along with some other emails and sort of malware deployments along the way. And I'll just sort of close with one last example of this isolation idea through hashing. I know that a lot of us tend to think about like hashing of a file, but sometimes that, to me, that tends to be like an overly specific thing to do, or like overly specific, sort of the wrong word for it, but it's effectively like taking a fingerprint of a person's entire body instead of just their fingers, which can also be uniquely identifiable. And so I've run into this with Mac malware, where they have this set of dependencies that are all location specific, of internal and third-party libraries. They're sort of like Windows imports. They're not exactly one-to-one. And one of the challenges that we had with sort of finding related ones was that codifying that knowledge was really difficult. And so even if we look for all of those strings that we'd seen before in that previous slide, in a very specific rule, and we tried to go through all the effort of making sure that there are only a certain number of dilibs being imported, and all of those were imported as dilibs. Even doing all of that, we would still get a number of false positives where a super short dilib would get included, or sort of other incidental sort of things would happen, which that happens, but hashing those values really allowed us to isolate those things and only hone in on what the dilibs actually were, instead of the potential of co-occurrence. And so that led us, all of that sort of journey led us to attributing the 3CX incident pretty quickly to a cluster called Apple Juice, because that the second stage Mac OS family called Update Agent used the exact same dependencies as previous Apple Juice families. And that's not to say like, oh, these were written by the exact same developer. But honing in on that sort of potentially trivial feeling signal allowed us to sort of like update our analyses and go hunting for stuff, other potential related files really, really quickly, rather than sort of relying on the vibes of what the Mac OS family was doing, or even in the other direction, it prevented us from having to completely reverse the sample to try and find code overlap or whatever would be useful in that attribution statement. So long story short, hashing helpful for isolating data into a single unique 64-character value. Not only is it handle better, either as an MD5 or a SHA-256, but then you can just sort of codify that knowledge, both what is included in that string or that data blob, but also ignoring what is outside of it. So that has been finding threat signals. Yeah, Sam, this has been fun.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me. I don't know if there are questions, because again, I'm bad at the YouTubes, but yeah.
No, we did
appreciate everyone's attention.
Yeah, we did get a question at the beginning. You were asking how do we do the YouTuber live stream thing or whatever. I think someone said like, "What's up, GreyNoisers?" or something like that. I forget. But anyways,
perfect.
Yeah, let's see. We got Brianna is asked Greg, once you're done with your main presentation, I'd love to know what the strangest security incident is that you've ever seen.
I can give you the strangest security incident I've ever caused. So how do I talk about this generically? There's a very popular meeting platform that enables video and audio, that was previously a customer of ours. I think that's about as generic as I can get. long story short, one of the cool things that we did at my previous job was be somebody that GreyNoise would look at. We would scan the internet emulating C2 servers to try and find more of them, or emulating infections to try and find C2 servers. One day, this giant corporation's video servers began responding to those probes with a different set of bytes than we'd ever seen before. And the first half of those bytes matched the expected command or the expected data to come back from the C2 server. Now, we had all this automation in place so that way when we found something, and this had been running for 2 years with no issue, and scanning the internet for 2 years and not having an issue, like, has been pretty good. And so that we weren't super honed in on it, but effectively, we then verdicted all of their video servers as being malicious. They're a customer of ours, so then that data flows to them and tells their SOC, hey, all of your video servers are infected, which was not the case. Obviously, it was just an error on our part. The inverse of that was that all of our other customers, then if they had our data flowing into their firewalls and things like that, were not able to access that entity's video servers that are sold as a service to millions and millions of people every day. So that was definitely a security incident that was the strangest that I've ever been a part of, because we told everybody that this mega corporation's things were infected, that we got it, I think, remediated and removed from all sort of those lists very, very quickly. But other than a lot of like junk e-crime and, incidents that I worked back when I was an incident responder in a previous life, there have been some APT 33 on Iranian crews incidents that I've worked, but they weren't terribly interesting, and they certainly weren't as strange as this one that was a little bit self-inflicted. So I hope that got some laughs and some
Well, cool. Well, thank you so much, Greg, for hanging out with us today. We really appreciate your presentation and your time.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, thanks for all that you do. If you enjoyed his chat, please give him some love on Twitter. We tweeted out his Twitter handle, so you can follow us on GreyNoise on Twitter, GreyNoise.io, and you'll find Greg's Twitter handle and all that good stuff. But I'm going to let you enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it, Sam. Thank you for having me. And GreyNoisers, we'll see you on the wire. Peace.
Awesome. Peace.